everyone, and welcome to the last of Brook's Breaking Barriers series for Sexual Health Week. These are a series of videos where staff from Brook, such as us, are exploring some of the barriers that we face in terms of sexual health services and also barriers to relationships and sex education. My name is Francesca Fiennes and I'm an education and wellbeing specialist at Brook. And in today's episode, we're tackling about how to discuss mandatory RSE and also how to go a bit beyond some of those mandatory requirements, as well as looking at the barriers to mandatory RSE. And I'm joined by Sophie, who I will let introduce themselves now.
Hi, I'm Sophie and I'm also an education and wellbeing specialist at Brook.
Great. So you're mainly working in Essex, aren't you? And transitioning into London. So for anyone watching the videos, an education and wellbeing specialist at Brook is somebody who mainly is teaching sex education in schools, but we're also do you do My Life as well?
I do the one-to-one support as well, yeah.
Great. So we also have another video on that for anyone who's watching. And then we're also training teachers, which is quite a big part of our role. And that's a lot of that is helping people, I guess, feel more confident and also getting ready to teach sex education. So obviously, mandatory RSE was introduced last year, a couple of years before in terms of the policy. And obviously, the reaction's been a bit mixed. I'm sure you see the same in Essex, that the implementation of delivering it is also not necessarily the ideal standard that we would want at the moment. So obviously, we know a lot of teachers are watching. We hope this conversation will be really useful for helping people begin to think about RSE and also hopefully feeling more confident around it. Don't want to go into too much detail, but before you give your answer. So the first question I have for you, Sophie, is what do you think some of the main barriers that are to teaching RSE? So maybe like something that has come up in a teacher training for you before.
Yeah, well, you touched on it briefly just then. I think one of the main barriers is teachers sort of feeling not prepared, and that's because maybe they haven't been given the resources, they haven't had the training. It sort of felt like, here's all the guidance and off you go, do what you must. And so when I first joined Brook, I'm quite new to Brook, I joined at the beginning of the year, and some of my first sessions were teacher training sessions, and I was sort of in a room with 50 teachers or on Zoom with 50 teachers, and a lot of them were just asking questions about how to deal with very specific questions, very specific topics. How should they set up the classroom? What should they do if this happens in a classroom setting? Or how should they tackle, they were asking very specific questions, which is completely fair enough, because I think to suddenly say to teachers, here's that massive range of RSE topics, just sort out the curriculum, guys, and have a go. It must have been really daunting, and I have definitely seen that in the teacher trainings I've done.
Yeah, absolutely. It's admittedly a lot to tackle, and obviously for those teachers who haven't trained in sex education or maybe haven't volunteered to do it, might feel like quite a big task. So there's definitely I guess for schools to think about what training staff need aside from just like what we would recommend. Obviously the government policy says one thing, but a lot of it's about feeling confident. So what are some tips that you would have for maybe gaining confidence around teaching RSE? And you can use your personal experience, I guess, as well.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, it is all about confidence, because I think one of the barriers, I suppose, as well for teachers and anybody teaching RSE is we're still dealing with like the shame and stigma around talking about those sorts of things, particularly sex, in an education setting and with a whole group of young people. I think some of my tips would be to identify, this was what was really helpful for me, was to identify where my panic zones were. So we call them like a comfort zone, a stretch zone, and a panic zone at Brook. So say, for example, my comfort zone when teaching RSE, and I think from talking to teachers during teacher trainings, their comfort zones were sort of consent and healthy relationships, and then a stretch zone, maybe STIs and contraception, because there's so much information there, to relay to young people, but also to remember for ourselves. And then a panic zone for me personally was talking about pornography with young people. So maybe starting at the panic zone and this is where places like Brook come in handy, because we offer teacher trainings, but we also have e-learning courses on the website. So that's what I did. I just looked at the e-learning courses on our website as well, before I started sort of teaching or talking to young people about some of those subjects that I thought I was going to find a little challenging. Another one of my tips, I suppose, and I say this in my teacher trainings as well, is that the classroom setup may need to be different. It may not feel like a normal class or a normal lesson, and that can actually be really beneficial for the teacher and for the young people, because you can set up your own boundaries. You know, we always say, don't we, at the beginning of sessions, please ask me questions, that's what I'm here for, but please don't ask me personal questions, and don't ask each other personal questions. Let's try and keep it a neutral space. So setting up those sorts of boundaries and giving both you and the young people a bit of leeway to sort of feel like it's not the standard lesson, it's a little bit different.
That's a great tip, and I like that you mentioned about setting the space and making sure that, you know, it can be a little bit different. You might get different behaviors from young people. You might also, you know, it's okay to, something I always tell people when I'm training, and I'm sure you feel the same, is that you're not expected to be some kind of encyclopedia. You don't have to know everything, but obviously you want to know more than the young people do, and you want to know also the accurate information as well, and to feel really comfortable, like you said, about those panic zones. I always think about mine. I think maybe because I've been teaching for a while, I don't have so many, but definitely there's some topics like drugs and alcohol I don't teach often. And I'm like, oh, I actually don't know how to answer every question around that. So I always think that's the subjects I'll focus on more. Great.
Yeah.
So you've told us a couple of places that you can go on the Brook website in terms of building up your confidence. Is there anything else that we have at Brook that you think is good for people to engage with in terms of our resources or our social media, or, you know, something like that?
Yeah, so we've got our e-learning courses on the Brook website, but we've also got our blogs, which are also by young people themselves. So we have young people who write for our blogs, talking about different experiences that are really helpful. And also on the Brook website, we've got our find a service. So if somebody, say for example, a young person comes to you in a session and wants an STI test or wants some more information on contraception, they can go on our find a service section of the Brook website and type in what they need and find a service that's going to help them, a clinic or further support maybe. And it's also like what you're saying, it's all about signposting. I feel like RSE is as much about the teaching as it is the signposting. We always finish our sessions, don't we, on signposting to other support services, maybe other organisations, places within Brook, people within Brook that they can speak to, because that's the other thing we haven't mentioned, I suppose, is like we don't know all the answers, and as specialists sometimes we don't. I've been stumped recently by questions about some young people were keen to know about a very specific law, and I had no idea. So I was really honest with them and I said, I don't know the answer to that, but what I am going to do is go and speak to my Brook colleagues, because I'm sure one of them knows, and then I'm going to come back, I'm going to let the teacher know, and they're going to give you that information.
Great. So as Sophie said, the blogs I think are really useful. I was going to mention that if you didn't, about also from us and our colleagues have written loads of really amazing things. Definitely checking out things like our social media as well. And obviously there are other organisations that do great work as well. It's not a kind of sparse space, like there are other people who are doing really great work as well. And obviously we recommend, if you have the means to get access to our training, so to be trained by people like Sophie and myself, particularly if you feel any sense of panic around teaching. So we just move quickly on to young people. So in terms of barriers that young people face in engaging with RSE, what do you think some of those are?
I think, again, the same with anybody and same with what teachers may feel, the shame, the stigma of approaching those sorts of subjects and those sorts of topics, particularly at school. I think young people may find it difficult because, again, talking from experience, I was a young person once, like I found it difficult to have those sorts of conversations at school. I found it intimidating or humorous because I was nervous about how we were going to approach those topics. And so that's something to bear in mind. Like the young people may be feeling exactly the same as you, nervous or feeling a bit not as confident to talk about it. And also, I think barriers that young people may face is just it's all about including everybody in RSE, and I think some of the barriers in RSE are similar to just everyday life for those young people at school. So making sure that we're being inclusive of everybody's sexual orientation, everybody's gender identity, everybody's different cultural backgrounds and beliefs. Those are really important because we don't want to exclude anybody or make anybody feel othered or alienated. So it's really making sure that when we're approaching RSE, that we're still being able to meet the needs of every individual young person in that room, because otherwise that is a huge barrier to them accessing that information.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, thinking for everyone who's watching, of course, is thinking about what the needs are in terms of the young people, I guess not just demographics, but also like if we're talking about consent or sexual assault, do you already know that this has happened to a young person in your class? Is there a young person where English is not their first language? Is there a young person who has a learning need? So really thinking about what the learning styles of your young people are as well. Because all very well doing like a class that has lots of speaking activities, but what happens if there's young people who really feel quite shy, or they're quite new to school, so just trying to think really specifically, not just about the overarching topics, but also your specific classes as well. Great. So in terms of overcoming some of those barriers and really thinking about Brook's approach to RSE, what do you think, if you were, I know obviously we have the position statement and we recommend looking at those as well, but what would you say in like 2 sentences, I guess, like the best tip of why RSE is so important, and why teaching it, not just why it's important, but why like a specific way of teaching it is important?
I think why teaching it is so important because first and foremost, I think RSE keeps everybody, not just young people, safe. It keeps people informed, and it means people will hopefully go on to have really healthy sexual relationships or romantic relationships or just relationships with friends, whoever. I think it just makes sure that people are able to make their own informed decisions and that everybody's on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
We teach RSE in the same way and everybody's being able to access that information because we've sort of been able to dismantle some of those barriers you've spoken about and I've spoken about. It means everybody has access to the same information.
So just quickly before we're getting to the end of today's talk, what do you think the main barriers are in a school? So an institutional barrier at a school.
I guess we always talk at Brook, don't we, about a whole school approach. And I think that's probably one of the biggest barriers. And also that RSE is one of those topics or one of those things that sometimes we leave for one day of a term or sometimes one day of a whole year. And it's not something that's then put into practice every day at school. And we're not talking about sort of having an RSE lesson every day. But I guess having a whole school approach, building a culture in a school and building an ethos in a school where to speak about that for young people to come forward to a safe space, to have check-ins with young people about some of those topics and keep revisiting and reinforcing those topics. For example, I guess having a whole school approach to me means if we are talking about LGBTQ plus relationships in RSE lessons, then we also need to be tackling and challenging LGBTQ plus bullying or stigma within the school. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And also what you said about, just quickly, what you were saying about pleasure is I guess we often speak about RSE topics or approach RSE topics from maybe a negative point of view to start with. So we talk a lot about infection and risk of pregnancy and consequences, and maybe some of the violence or the unhealthy sort of behaviours. Whereas if we start with the positives, then that can it's a really good place to start. And it means, it's easier for young people to access.
Absolutely. I think it's a great point about that some schools currently might have the approach of just doing it like whenever there's a bit of time. And obviously we just can't stress enough like how important RSE is. Obviously we understand that school is a busy place and that teachers will already have a lot of work as it is. So adding on RSE, like admittedly, is a big task, particularly if you're not doing it every day like we are. Like, we have to kind of code switch between a maths class, for example, and then thinking about how we want to speak in an RSE class as well. So just lastly could you explain for anyone who doesn't know what the spiral curriculum is? So what the kind of gold standard of teaching RSE is that we would suggest at Brook?
So the spiral curriculum, or like the scaffolding technique, is where a school implements this approach in their curriculum to make sure that young people are constantly revisiting subjects that they may have already visited in different years, different age year groups, and then reinforcing those ideas. So, for example, before young people come to secondary school, they will have hopefully looked at healthy relationships in terms of their friendships, families, different types of families, and they will have also touched on consent and how we give consent in our everyday lives. Then when they come to secondary school in year 7, we can start looking at, okay, so we revisit some of those things that they've maybe spoken about and learned, and we add to it. So we start talking about, okay, but what happens in a more romantic relationship? And we get them thinking about if, you know, those sorts of relationships, which can then build again, year 8, year 9 onwards. We're talking about consent in an intimacy context, and can then speak about contraception and STIs. So we're sort of always building on knowledge that's already there, but constantly revisiting the things that they've learned to make sure that there's understanding, answer any questions, and just make it feel really seamless and like there aren't any gaps. We're covering it all at an age and stage appropriate level.
So I think that's a great point to end on. Just want to thank Sophie for joining me today in conversation, and thank you to everyone who's hopefully watching this. I think this was a really useful one. You'll be able to find all the links that we've discussed today below in the video description. If you've enjoyed this, I'd really recommend watching the other series that we have in this for this week, particularly because they do all gel together really well. Having hosted all of them, I know that there's points that connect them all, so I'd really recommend watching all of that. And obviously, if you'd like to find out more about Brook, please go to our website, which is www.brook.org.uk. Bye, and have a great day wherever you're watching this, everyone.